Tell me about the first automobile you ever saw.
It came up the road there in front of the house and went this way and stopped, and it didn't have a top. But they said that they did have a top that they laid down because they said it took more air to run them with the top up. Was harder to run, and they could get more power the other way. And so Dad said, of course we were all out looking at it, big-eyed, thinking it was so wonderful. And one of the salesmen said, well, you want to take a little ride just down to the barn and back? I said, no, I don't. But my sister did. She got in and rode down to the barn and back so she could say she had ridden in an automobile. And when my dad bought an automobile in 1917, I was about 16, and you could drive if you were 16. So Mr. Wright sold it to Dad, and I had to go to Elkins and learn to drive an automobile. And we could go up the road towards Beverly, 2 miles. They finally got that paved. 2 miles. We could go out 33, 1 mile. We could go on down the other way, 1 mile, and other mile towards Buckhannon. I learned to drive, and that road to take it home. My, oh my. I drove it lots of times, but it would just wind around through little creeks, and then I taught my father to drive, and Dad would start out. He'd hit the on this side, or he'd hit on this side, but then you just got a hammer out and pound up, and everything would be all right again. But we didn't have a top. The top was down at that time, so we could drive better.
What kind of a car was it you got in 1970?
A Dodge.
What was the road like from between Huttonsville and Beverly at that time?
Mud, of course, and rocks. And
how muddy?
I remember seeing Miss Hansel. She was the minister's wife coming up to our house, and she was holding up her skirt on both sides to keep it out of the mud. And in the winter, we didn't use a car at all. It went in. Jake built a sort of a garage for it, went in, and they jacked up the wheels, and there it sat. And we would walk to church. And we did have sidewalks part of the time, so we didn't have to walk in the mud all the time.
Well, if you put the car in the garage, then how did you get around in the winter?
With a train. We went down on the train to Elkins. At that time, trains went to Huntsville, went up a piece, and we had a railroad station then, and the train would pull up a piece, and then it would back around on a Y and get turned to go back to Elkins.
How much did it cost to ride the train from Elkins to Hutton?
Oh, not much. I imagine about a dime.
I remember one of my uncles talking about his Model T Ford and not having heat in the car, and sometimes they would build a little fire in the car, but just to keep their feet warm.
They would?
Mm-hmm. I guess near the floorboards there was like holes in the, like cars today, but they'd put a tin can in the car and make a little fire in it. And gave them a little heat to warm their hands. I can remember him telling us stories about traveling from Frank to Stanton or Monterey, Virginia, and different places. And there'd be no heat in the car in the wintertime. And so that's what they would do. As a matter of fact, one of my other uncles was courting his wife-to-be and lived in Stanton. And that's how he kept warm, by building a little fire in the car. So he got to Stanton. From Frank. And then he eventually got married and brought his wife back to Frank.
Did you ever see his car?
No, I never saw his car. Not that particular car. Of course, they changed cars pretty often back in those days because sometimes they'd run off the road or wreck them or something. So they were always buying another used car, or secondhand car, as we would call them. And maybe once every year or so, the people would get another car. Because I can remember growing up, probably like when I was a teenager in my 20s, seeing cars along the road in West Virginia, and I guess people often would buy a used car and run it until it stopped and just leave it and go buy another one. And then eventually, I guess with the laws that were passed, you were not allowed to leave cars just sitting along the road. And I think James Manchin was one of the people that helped to get that stopped and to clean up West Virginia by getting old cars off the road. But as a child growing up, you can remember seeing a car parked along a road, just stopped, and people just get another car.
They'd wreck a lot?
Not necessarily wreck them, but they just wear them out, or they quit running. And so I guess an old used car wasn't hard to come by, or, didn't cost that much. And most people back in those days had a job. You had the tanneries, and so people would just get another car. Probably would cost them more to try to fix up the old one. And so they would just buy another used car. And unfortunately, they just leave them along the road, or wherever they stopped, that's where they stayed until the state would come and pick them up, I guess. But then you weren't allowed to do that in later years. We used to take old tires, which there was a plenty of back then, because it seemed like somebody was always had a flat tire. And we'd roll them up and down the road, and sometimes the kids would get in them, and you'd roll them. So that was a lot of fun.
Right along 250?
Well, that was like on the lower road. We wouldn't go up on the highway. You didn't dare do that.
What kind of cars do you remember from your childhood days? What they look like?
I remembered hopping on the cars that had the fenders. Of course, on the lower road, you didn't drive too fast because they took what they called cinders to fill in the holes, because the road wasn't paved, so the roads was always full of holes. And they would bring cinders and fill in the holes, so cars that traveled over didn't drive too fast. And so if your uncle or whoever was driving a car had fenders on it and had the window rolled down, you just hop on and ride down the road a little bit. So that's what I basically remember about the cars. Because I guess, cars were becoming more modern when as we were growing up. But you might have an older cousin that would be driving her dad's car, and you'd hop in and go for a little ride, up the road and back, and that type of thing. And then as you had children, because a lot of my aunts and uncles had lots of kids, 12, 13, 14, 15 children, and when the children were old enough, they would get in the cars and ride them up and down the roads and maybe run into the coal house or a telephone pole or something. So you just junk that one and get another one.
You think all these cars along the road will be a real temptation for young people learning to drive?
Yeah, I think so. Of course, back then kids would just get in a car, and even before you had your license, and your parents would let you drive a little bit, and that's how a lot of them learn, by trial and error, I call it. Learn how to drive a car.
Was that your story?
No, I didn't learn to drive like that. Actually, I didn't learn to drive till I was in my 20s, but a lot of my cousins learned to drive early.
How'd you learn?
I took driver's ed. When I applied for a job, I had to learn to drive. And so I took driver's ed before going to work and got my driver's license and bought a car.
Now, you told me a while ago that when you were a child, you used to take the train
Yes,
to Beverly.
right.
Tell me all about that. Where did the train run? Where did you get on, and where did you get
Well,
off?
it got on in Elkins at the railroad station, and there was a railroad station right down here behind us, between us and the lumber plant that's there now. There was a station there, and when I was even about 4 years old, my father was a friend of the conductor on the train, and I would go to the train and tell him I wanted to go see my grandmother, and they'd bring me up here, and then my grandmother would stand out in the back and meet me when I got off the train and walked up here.
Tell me other details about it. Do you remember how many cars there were on the train, or what it costs, or anything else about it?
Well, I know it didn't cost me anything because my father made arrangements with this conductor to look after me when I wanted to come. I don't know what the cost was, but it wasn't too much. And lots of people used the train between here and Elkins for transportation to work and to school and all. And there were, I guess, 2 or 3 cars on it, and a caboose.
And where did the train go after it left here then?
It went clear up to Huttonsville. And I would sometimes go to my grandmother's at Huttonsville, but not as often as I came here. I had my other grandmother lived in what is now the Cardinal Inn. And I would go up there, and I had an uncle that lived in Huttonsville. And I would go to his house, and he would take me on up to my grandmother.
Was that a narrow gauge, very local train, or?
Yeah, it wasn't necessarily a narrow gauge. It was a regular train, but it made the local run twice a day, morning and evening. And lots of people, Miss Helen Harding, I don't know whether you ever knew any of the Hardings or not.
No.
Miss Helen Harding worked at what was the fare company and at Weese's store. And she would ride back and forth on the train to work, and lots of people did it. There were, and then there were people who went to the college and on and to high school, and in Elkins, and they rode the train.
Why did they ride the train rather than driving a car there?
I don't know. I guess because it was handy and maybe cheaper.
So when you were a young child growing up, there were different ways you could travel. You could travel on the train, you could travel by pony cart, you could travel by.
Well, we had a car soon after cars came out. Let's see, what kind of a car did we have? I can't remember what make. I think ours was a Buick. I know my grandmother's car up at the Cardinal Inn was a Buick. It's the one I learned to drive on. And I got my license when I was about 14. But when I was 12, I drove my grandmother and my great aunt and my mother to Quebec, Canada.
You did?
I did.
Tell me about that.
And
What an adventure that must have been.
well, that was an adventure. They wanted to go, and my mother wanted to go, and I don't remember why my mother wasn't driving, but she wasn't. She was letting me drive. And when we got to the border, they didn't even ask for her license, but when we got back and found out that she didn't even have her license with her, and of course I didn't have license, but they just let us go by both ways. We went clear to Quebec. My grandmother apparently had some kind of an interest in Quebec that she wanted to see about, and we took it. And I was so thrilled with the Niagara Falls and the Grand Rapids. That was a real thrill, and they had such beautiful flowers. I was scared that they'd ask for license and so forth, but they didn't. Somehow we got by without it, and Mother discovered when we got back that she didn't even have her license with her. And then I got my license when I was 14.
How long did they continue passenger service by train from between Elkins and?
Oh, it
all
just
that?
stopped a few years ago. Just about, I'd say in the 80s it stopped. But I know I hated to see the old station go. It had been used for a while with recycling. And I guess nobody kept it up. It wasn't kept up, and it was a wooden structure, not brick like the one in Elkins.
The first car you ever saw?
Yeah,
Tell me about that.
it was a Model T, Henry Ford. I forget what model it was. Somewhere around 1920, I think. I remember the first airplane I ever saw.
Tell me about that.
I saw it flying over a farm there. I guess it came out of Elkins. The fellow used to come in there through the summer or fall and take you, charge you so much for the ride. I guess that's when I saw it.
Tell me about the first automobile you ever saw.
I guess it was a Model T Ford. A neighbor had one right close to where we lived, but I don't know what model it was. In 1923 then, my dad bought a new car. It was what they call a baby Overland.
A what?
A baby Overland. It was made by the Overland. American, I guess, American company. American Motors, I think, made them in. And it was just two-seated, open. Wasn't no glass on the windshield. You had side curtains in case it rained. You'd have to put those curtains up, fixed on a rod. Then they fastened on the inside the top. And 19 and 25, then he traded it for a newer one. In 1927, then he decided he'd get him another one. So he got what they call a Star, 4-passenger. It had glass doors, windows in it, all the way around. A little lower, kind of a little better, car. We drove it. I suppose up in the 30s, early 30s. Then he quit driving.
Now, when he got this first car in 23, what kind of shape were the roads in? What was it like traveling around in an old car at that time?
Oh, you couldn't get anywhere in the wintertime with it. The only time you could run would be through summertime and fall, the early fall. But the roads was nothing but mud then, you might say. Of course, the mountain road was pretty solid. Of course, there's a lot of rock in it. But back through this lane, from the foot back through into Beverly, man, you couldn't get through there hardly with a road wagon in the wintertime like that. Ground was so soft, and when it didn't freeze anyway.
It didn't.
I say, until it froze, you couldn't hardly get through with a team of horses with a wagon, even 4 head of horses hardly. The roads were better in 1927. Mm-hmm. And from then on, why, it just kept getting, better. I can remember when they put that road from Elkins to Beverly, but I don't remember what year that was. Well, I remember a couple of the men from Beverly there was working on it when there was a blacktopping. They used to have brick roads in Elkins. All their streets and everything were brick. And they had from what they call the city limits, they had a narrow gauge cement road. I suppose it was 6 foot wide. Come up there to the Catholic cemetery.
Did people used to get stuck in the road a lot when it was bad?
Oh, yeah.
Tell me about that.
You would. You'd get ruts in them. And you just more down in it. In some places in the road, yeah, where it was soft. You couldn't get anywhere in the wintertime back then.